Let me see if we can do the sharing. Okay. Are we seeing that?
Yep.
Sure, of alpha.
Okay. We need to make any adjustments? Our volume okay? I know we have to get right close to it to speak.
Does anybody need it bigger?
You okay?
A little bigger for me.
That good?
That's good. Thank you.
All right, this presentation is a continuation of what Christine just presented. And it was filed or test on September 5th, 2020, the structure of our alpha. Okay.
So now that you can see the text, does anybody need it bigger? Is that good?
Is that it?
Good.
Okay. When it comes to the external events of Millerite history, most of us in this movement have not understood well the external events of that 65 years from 1798 to 1863. We haven't understood it well at all. And because we haven't understood it well at all, we also need to catch up. We need to see the broad sweeps of external events that led us all the way into the Civil War time period, the successive steps that they took. But to get that broad overview, we need to study that history, understand that history well before we begin to make application. So as we discuss this history, please do not assume that there's application being made. When we speak about the external events that occurred, then it's to catch us up. There will be applications made. But first of all, we actually need to be familiar with the history. Mistakes occur in the movement when we quickly jump to application without correctly understanding the history.
I think there's one page before that. I don't know what was on it.
Okay, hold on. Oh, it says page 3. Okay.
Yeah, I thought maybe it went past one page.
Oh, we sure did. Val, go ahead and read that one.
I don't know how much we need it, but
Okay, it's probably more of an introduction too.
We're going to review some concepts that we're already familiar with. We need to remember not to be quick on making applications, but to be able to remember how we arrived at those applications. We need to be led through the steps of application, and that's really where the authority and power of that study comes in. Remembering that parable methodology. We cannot go over these truths enough, and almost every time the message grows, it seems to be 90% review and 10% pushing in further direction. We're also going to review some of the things that we have learned at the German International Camp meeting and what we studied about Millerite history. We cannot make application of Millerite history if we're forgetting what's already been taught. It's absolutely crucial we remember what was taught there and how this has developed.
It's not moving to the next one.
That button up at the top that is right next to the plus sign. If you hover over that, is that not that one, but the one to the right of that? Is that an up and down button?
It says
That's a
skip to
flip to page.
page.
Okay, so that's not, no, sorry.
Yeah, my up and down button, it's not letting me go to the next page. Why is that?
I don't know, that's weird.
I know. Okay, that's probably why I missed that one.
Yeah.
Okay.
You do you have a wheel on your mouse? Will it let you?
No, I'm just doing it. I guess I should probably put the mouse.
Yeah, the wheel sometimes makes it easier not to miss one versus the thing on the right.
We're gonna go. Okay, let me see.
We're not going straight into application. we're going to just familiarize ourselves just a little with those external events. Obviously, there's application already made. We understand 1840, that the events of August 11th and all of that. So we did make one application last week, and we spoke about the advances in information technology and in the ability to communicate. We spoke about the end of ancient Israel, the Pax Romana. That was the Roman peace on land, but also on sea. How they cleared the sea of pirates. All of this sets up Acts 27. And Paul is able to not just take that fourth missionary journey, but the preceding ones before it on ship. Then one of the things that enabled him to do that was that Rome had cleared the sea of pirates. There's this nearly around 200-year time frame where the gospel can spread in relative safety. So this Roman peace that had not been heard of before in Earth's history, 200-year time frame on land and sea, the network of Roman roads that had been built. So when Paul is traveling by road, what enables him? It's this network of really quite advanced road building techniques. Feet deep into the earth, many of them surviving till today, 2,000 years later. So you have everything external to that time period set in place, so the gospel can go forward and spread through as much of the known world as was then humanly possible when God is working through humanity. So you have the line here of showing the time, peace on land and peace on sea, between 27 BC and 100 AD. That's nearly 200 years. And Christ was born. Well, the line of ancient Israel, Omega line, from 4 BC to 100 AD, time of Patmos. So, so it spans near 200 years. So unprecedented peace and economic prosperity through the empire, which spanned from England in the north to Morocco in the south and Iraq in the west.
We spoke about the Protestant Reformation. What gave the Protestant Reformation the ability to spread its power was in that 50-year time period previous to the Protestant Reformation, the invention and perfecting to a reasonable degree of the printing press, the ability to print quickly, print and distribute material. So Martin Luther wants to nail his thesis on that door. He can then have it printed and spread like the leaves of autumn. This gives power to the Protestant Reformation, that technology just on time.
The beginning of modern Israel. This is where we began to make application to the beginning and the end of our own peoples. Beginning of modern Israel. What year were the train systems developed? The first passenger train, month and year. First passenger train begins operating December 25th, 1830, just in time, a few days before 1831. In 1831, what is William Miller going to do? He's going to begin to travel and teach his message of the second advent. So you have the beginning of modern Israel. It began in 1798. And also during this period, you have the inventions of trains and steamboats. And the first train developed, began running in December 25th, 1830. It was the first steam-powered passenger service. This track laid. So between 1830 and 1840, there was 1,800 miles of track that was laid. And the first call between 1840 and 1850, by that time, there was 9,000 miles of track laid. And then the third call is to the world. From 1850 to 1860, you got more than 30,000 miles of track. And so that was the network serving of all states.
Beginning of modern Israel, this is where we began to make application to the beginning and to the end of our own people. Beginning of modern Israel, what year? I just said that, huh? What year? Well, the first passenger train begins operating December 25, 1830. So you have the trains, but you just don't have trains. You have the steamboats. You don't think much about the steamboats, but they were a serious means of travel and communication back then. The most famous state-led creation of the market revolution was undoubtedly New York's Erie Canal, began in 1817. It was 364 miles of man-made waterway that flowed between Albany on the Hudson River and Buffalo on Lake Erie. The canal connected the eastern seaboard and the Old Northwest, 364 miles of man-made waterway. It set off canal frenzy. But along with the development of the steamboat created a new and complete national water transportation network by 1840. So when the Millerites were conducting their camp meetings, they're coming by passenger trains and steamboats, and only a generation early, that would have been unheard of.
You have the transition from an agricultural to an industrial economy that took more than a century in the United States. But that long development entered its first phase from the 1790s through the 1830s. When you look at that reform line, 1798, 1790s, to when the message must begin to spread, 1831 and the 1830s. From the 1790s to the 1830s, you have the first phase of the Industrial Revolution, and it revolutionizes how information can be spread. So when they say of August 1844, when the midnight cry arrives and it spreads across the United States with such power and such speed in August, September, October, in just a couple of months, what gave it that power, that speed beyond the message itself, was the ability to travel by steamboat, by rail car. And also by then, although not in regular usage till a little later in 1844, you have the telegraph. Morse code, what God has wrought. And it's going to broadcast two important things. One, what has God wrought? And the other focus on everyone's mind, except for the Millerite, the 1844 presidential election. Yeah, the beginning of modern Israel, 1798, you got steamboats, you got trains, you got communications, telegraph. And yeah, so the message is now being spread.
When we talk about this century-long industrial revolution, we had a couple of interesting thoughts from people, and it seemed that most of the research being done further on that was coming out of Wales, actually. So a member currently residing in Wales messaged Elder Tess about the work of the Industrial Revolution in the 1888 history. And that's an interesting thought. Another member of Wales also speaking about our going back much further into history and the time in Egypt, the beginning of ancient Israel. Elder Tess suggests this is something that we're seeing, a pattern of how God works externally to also be able to spread his gospel messages at those key points in history. We haven't covered the beginning of ancient Israel, and we haven't covered 1888, but we've covered the end of ancient Israel, the beginning of modern Israel, and the end of modern Israel and the Protestant Reformation. The end of modern Israel of 1989, the big bang of the information age, that year, the time of the end, and the development of the World Wide Web.
that was where we did make application, just simply a simple thought that one of the evidences that we are in a reform line, that God is having a specific movement with a specific message that is to spread and give light to the world. One of the evidences for that is that there is this big bang in the way that information can be communicated. The evidence is no more evident than what we're doing right now when we are covering multiple continents at one point in time, which was unheard of in the 1830s. So you got we're in it's the end of modern Israel. That's us. And which the end of the time of the end began in 1989. And so we're on this in this movement, and we don't go back to the SDA pastors to learn because they have no life. And there is no life outside of this movement. And we are able to communicate throughout the entire world through the World Wide Web.
So basically this just tells us, again, what we've been reviewing. The 4 different histories and how just at the right time, the different modes of communication for that time period to propel the message to go forth to the individuals that God is reaching out to. So the lines we've drawn here are the mega histories of ancient and modern Israel, and we're yet to fill them in. The mega of ancient, what we're placing with that is the omega of modern. We've begun by laying out the omega of modern. That's 1989, 9/11, the Sunday Law, close of probation, and the Second Advent. The 5 key waymarks is the hand of God, and it's his method of drawing out a people. So we have this line of the 144,000. We have the priests, the Levites, and the Nethinims. We've gone through all of that in previous presentations and studies, and if that's entirely new to people, and if you've been here, and then I would encourage you to go back and watch a series from this first presentation titled Apis Bull. It's the first of the series that we've done here in Australia. It will cover these histories of ancient and modern Israel.
So we have 4 groups: priests, Levites, Nethinims, and the 144,000. We have 1989, 9/11, 2014, 2019, and 2021. November 9th, 2019 through 2021 marks Jacob's time of trouble for the first group called. The first of 4 successive periods of the time of trouble. The first of 4 successive harvests. We have the Sunday Law waymark on the line of 1,000. Bring that down to the Levites and the Nethinims. We're just showing the 4 different lines of the 144,000, the priests, the Levites, Nethinims, and the time of trouble and the harvest.
The end of ancient Israel. We go from 4 BC. Oh no. Sorry. Not sure what happened.
Oh, you jumped way up. You're almost to the end.
I know. I don't know what happened.
You don't have a wheel?
We
You
have
don't-
the remote mouse. I mean, it just kind of started acting up. His own little thing. All right, let's see.
You were only like on 10 or 11, somewhere in there, 11, maybe 12. The last time I looked at the page number anyway.
There we go. Oh, I think
don't
we were just
remember.
talking about the 4 BC. There we go.
If it's possible, I know that people need it bigger, but if you take it down just a little bit, we might be able to see the whole slide. If
Okay.
that works for everybody else, just because we're missing the right-hand side.
Okay.
If that works for you guys, go ahead and let her know.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
So at the end of ancient Israel, we have 4 BC. We have 27 AD, the baptism of Christ, the arrival of the second angel. 2014, which is right here. Now we're talking the priest's line here, superimposed over with the ancient Israel. We've got 2014, which is the first temple cleansing. The second angel arrives at 9/11, and then at 2014, waymark, he begins his work. And so between 2014 and 2019, and at 2019, that's the cross. In 2021, we refer to as Pentecost. So we have the preparation, the 4 steps of plowing, the early rain, the latter rain, and the harvest. Oh, the first group called. This is the disciples. The disciples are plowed under the administration of John the Baptist.
We can't hear you, Phil.
At the baptism, you have the second angel, Christ, who arrives. He goes through this time period in the wilderness, and he doesn't yet begin his work. The first temple cleansing, he announces the beginning of his work. John the Baptist begins to cease teaching, and he is in prison. From that first temple cleansing through to the second temple cleansing, 2019, which is the time period just prior to the cross through Gethsemane, the upper room. The cross marks the close of probation and the beginning of the time of trouble for the first group called the disciples, and they are scattered.
This is their time of trouble. From the cross to the Pentecost. At Pentecost, they come out of that time of trouble and they're united. And then they have a message. And what are they going to do? They're going to go to the second group. They go back to the church, to the Jews that they reach at Pentecost. So they go back to the Jewish nation. You have a second group, second gathering in, 2 calls to the church, 2 calls to God's people. First, the disciples under John the Baptist and Christ, and then they're going to go back to that same nation at Pentecost.
So from Pentecost to 34 AD.
Closer. We
So
can't
from
hear.
Pentecost to 34 AD, and 34 AD is which time prophecy? The stoning of Stephen. 70 years, 70 weeks, 490. This is that 490-year time period at the end of which the Jewish nation is cut off. So 34 AD lines up with the Sunday law. 34 AD, what do they do? First the church, then the world. 34 AD, they go from the church, from taking the message to the church. Now probation has closed for that institution, and now they're going to take it to the world, to the Gentiles. So from 34 AD to 70 AD, next you have the second advent. 100 AD, the island of Patmos and John the Revelator. So you got a group, the disciples that are coming out from the Pharisaical teaching. And 34 AD, they go back to the church. So there's two calls to the church. And then after that, there's one call that goes out to the world after 34 AD.
So you have two groups that belong to the church and then one to the world. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the first portion of Acts is all to tell us of what occurs before God's people go to the world, before 34 AD, before Sunday law. That becomes so important for us to understand, because what is Adventism looking for? It's just looking for the Sunday law. That is as if a Pharisee is walking through history, walking through 490 years, just waiting for 34 AD. And what does he miss? What does he fail?
But by the time he gets to 34 AD, it's too late. John has come and done his work and died. Christ has come, done his work. That message is already there. It's already rejected. It's already failed. If they're waiting to 34 AD, that's as if they're not going to study for a test. You're not going to study for a test. You're just going to wait for it to arrive. Sign up for university, travel, enjoy yourself, do nothing, and then sit that bar exam and see how you do. That was the behavior of the Jewish nation. They failed to see the steps that led to 34 AD.
Like, look at that and compare it to people that are in the movement that don't watch the presentations or read the articles and then expect to pass the test.
Yeah. And if they failed in those steps, where did they end up in 34? Failure. That's the exact mentality of Adventism today. They go into those gospels and make neat, lovely moral applications and don't realize that they're looking at a prophetic history that was designed to prepare God's people prior to them giving a message to the world, prior to Sunday law. What did the Jews have wrong? What did they not understand? The nature of the kingdom. And what else? The nature of Christ, or to rephrase that, his character, what he looks like, present truth, time. They don't know the time of their visitation.
They did know some of their time of their visitation. There's some that are studying the prophecies. They know it is soon, and all of Adventism says the Sunday law is soon. But do they know when? They don't understand the prophecy, so they have a rough idea of time, but they don't have things clear. They don't have the dates. It isn't clear in their mind. They just know they're close. Just like Adventism today, they know they are close. But because of their misunderstandings, they're letting go of that prophetic message. They don't have a structure to work with.
And I think that's why, for me being in this movement, I'm not blinded. And, again, the waymarks and where we're watching and we're waiting, so that when things are happening, we know why it's happening and where we need to be and what's up ahead. So the nature of the kingdom and the nature of the king. If you don't understand the kingdom, you don't understand the king who runs the kingdom. So they don't understand the nature or character of God's kingdom, but then they also don't understand the character of God. And when you don't know what a God looks like and you want to construct one, what do? You build one in your own image, and that is idolatry. They built one in their own image, and when their God was before them, they could not recognize him. That is Adventism today. I think when I first heard that, I got really scared, and that we can all fall there. We can all just keep moving along, and when it's here, it's too late. If we haven't already decided to be on the path, on the platform.
They cannot recognize God because they have built up God built in their own image. God has to come through messages and messengers that were designed to teach people his character. And people fight against that when it goes against their own set worldview. What did the Jews not understand? They did not understand the character of the king. They did not understand the nature of the kingdom. And they did not understand the external events. This isn't just about their internal experience. This is all about what was supposed to happen to Rome. They don't understand the external events. That becomes also a crucial failure. So when we see the events today, it's not just the internal understanding of the kingdom of God that causes failure. It's not understanding correctly the external events. You know, Elder Tess here talks about idolatry, building a God in our own image. And I think it was Vespers, Elder Tess's Vespers 2 weeks ago, when she talked about Jimmy Savile building his own God in his own image. And that's a scary thought, because maybe some of us don't have that image, that horrible image that Jimmy Savile has of his own God. But just the same, we make an image of our own God in our own minds. It's still idolatry, so we still fail. So we need to understand the nature of the kingdom, the character of our God correctly.
In their history, the glorious land is Israel. They don't understand Rome, but you could also argue they don't understand the glorious land. And what is going to happen to the glorious land? Each waymark in this sequence is a point where they should have recognized external and internal events, and they failed. When you think of Adventism, Adventism stands here prior to the Sunday law. They've been through 1989, 9/11, 2014, and 2019. They've been through over the 30 years. And just like the Jews of old, they're looking for the Sunday law, looking to the 34 AD with no prophetic framework and a complete misunderstanding about the character of God in external events. This is why we say over and over again, a correct understanding of external news sources, what we can believe, what we can't believe, what is truth, what is conspiracy theories, is life and death. I know for me, I was naive. I thought, when I don't really need to know this or that, and with history or with current events, and with all that we're learning, it's crucial to know the current events. It's crucial to know what's happening And as what was Elder Tess and Elder Parminder saying, it is life and death.
We've done this before. We all believe in one world government. That is what is coming. But then there's two different things to fear. You can fear globalism, UN, or you can fear nationalism. Externally, people all across the world are split by whether they see globalism as the threat or nationalism as a threat. Whether they're in the United States or Germany or Russia or Spain or Brazil or India, they are split between which threat they see as being the one to fear. Globalism is that wicked UN. It's the satanic deep state. That's the theory of QAnon. Secret societies, the Rothschilds, the Illuminati, George Soros, Bill Gates, growing immorality since the signs, the 666, song lyrics. If you believe this is the worldview that you're to fear, you stand in line with QAnon, and who is their hero? The only one that can save them. Trump is their hero. You can do all of this not through Adventism, certainly not through Walter Veith. All he's done is poach conspiracy theories from Protestantism. He has no peculiar Adventist message. It's poached Protestantism. If you fear nationalism, you see the seventh kingdom as a US dictatorship. You look at ancient Israel and see the tribes, one as a dictator controlling the others through manipulation and force. When you're a country like Mexico, for example, you're watching your population get more unhealthy. There is growing obesity crisis. People are eating a lot of junk food, and Mexico decides they want to bring in food labeling laws to help people make better choices about what is healthy and what is unhealthy. So they want to bring in more clear packaging. So junk food can't be as sold without people being aware of the dangers to their health. Just as you would put it on cigarette packaging, Mexico wants to do that. What does the United States do? The United States likes to export junk food, so they control Mexico through their trade agreements. If Mexico wants a trade agreement with the United States, they are not allowed to put on their own packaging health safety labels.
But Kenya wants to ban plastic, ban the plastics, ban the use of plastic bags. And where does the United States want to dump all of its plastic trash? In Kenya. Who has the upper hand in those trade agreements? There are countries trying to do the right thing for their own people when it comes to plastic and when it comes to food labeling. And they can't get that done because of these American trade agreements, NAFTA. They force junk food on South American countries because they have that export market and they can control that. That's just one small sub-issue where the United States already acts as a global bully. Well, it already controls and manipulates. Mexico can't go to the UN and have the upper hand. It's controlled through America. We see this as a union between the Republican Party and the corrupt socially conservative Protestantism. We understand this based on the parables World War I plus World War II equals World War III.
And someone in the world, a Gentile, not in the sophisticated way this movement can do that, but they can see that. And if you see nationalism is the global threat, Trump is a dictator. So when you have 34,000 people marching in Germany, marching in Berlin, saying we believe in QAnon, And by the way, we are aware of the Rothschilds and the Illuminati threat and George Soros and Bill Gates and that wicked World Health Organization that's trying to vaccinate us all, control us through this pandemic, through secret societies, through the satanic deep state. This is Walter Veith's message. Where does Adventism stand? Whether you're a conference attending member, whether you're part of an independent ministry, where does Adventism stand when they're standing before Sunday law? Whether you're a Pharisee or whether you're a Sadducee, the greatest threat is that they all stand under globalism because they don't understand the character of God and they don't understand the nature of his kingdom and they don't understand the external events.
Hi, Helen Legina, it's 12:24, so 6 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So priest, Levites, Nethinim, 144,000, are all being torn by this one issue between globalism and nationalism. Why do we have two sets of protesters in the United States fighting? Across the world, there's now a division between two groups of people. It can be summarized simply as saying globalism or nationalism. Globalism taught through conspiracy theories, or the threat of nationalism taught through parable teaching. Once you see that divide, it starts to impact every area of your life. Once this message grew and spread, all of a sudden we had to reinvestigate our individual position on vaccination. Because what does the globalism side say? Those 34,000 people marching through Berlin, holding up QAnon signs, fighting against a satanic deep state, fighting vaccinations, it's part of one mindset and one methodology. The world is divided. Adventism is divided. But as our institution, whether it's a general conference or even worse, if it's an independent ministry, they stand by and large on the globalism side of the issue, on the wrong side of the issue. That's why ancient Israel was overthrown, shipwrecked in 34 AD. That's why we can see what Adventism is heading towards, the rocks that will destroy it at Sunday law. But God has a movement that understands external events, that understands increasingly from 1989, the character of God.
We're talking here about the Omega histories. We want to step back some. As we've discussed before, we have the three histories. This was ancient Israel, and it will come back to the history of Babylon. And this is the Omega of ancient. They're in captivity to Rome. This middle history, they come out of Babylon, and they were meant to complete that work, build the temple, reform. Going back to the beginning of the ancient Israel, they're calling out of Egypt. We need to go back to the studies of the Apis bull to see how these three histories are linked.
Then we want to take modern Israel backwards as well. This is the end of modern, and this is the middle history, when the work was to be completed. That was the 1888 history. Then we come back, and what we are discussing now is our Alpha, the Alpha of modern Israel. We want to see the structure for our Alpha.
This is our Alpha history, and we're constructing the line of the 144,000. We've constructed that last week, and it was done in Germany last year. 1798, 1840, 1850, 1861, and 1863. Just to remind us, we come back to the Omega history of ancient and modern, And you have 2 calls to the church and 1 call to the world. So 2 calls to the church and 1 call to the world. The 144,000 being part of this number.
Coming back to the Alpha History of Modern Israel, we have 1798, 1840, 50, 61, and 1863. How many of these have external events attached to them? Coming back to 1798, all of them have external events attached to them. We've discussed this a little last week, particularly 1850, but you have 1798. You have the events of Rome, the taking of the Pope captive. You have Napoleon go to Egypt, the beginning of his Egyptian campaign. So there are lots of events in 1798.
Let's pause it here.
Okay.
We could.
We left off here, right? Coming back to the Alpha History of Modern Israel, we have the 1798, 1840, 1850, and 1861 and 1863. And how many of them have external events attached to them? Coming back to 1798, all of them have external events attached to them. We discussed this a little last week, particularly in 1850, but you have 1798 and you have the events in Rome and taking the Pope captive. You have Napoleon go to Egypt, the beginning of his Egyptian campaign. So there are lots of events in 1798.
In 1850, we talked about the 1850 Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act. 1861, what happened in 1861? Let me start over. 1840, we'll discuss more of 1840 as we go along.
Oh, you're fading. We can't hear you.
1840, we'll discuss more of 1840 as we go along. 1850, we talked about the 1850 Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act. 1861, what happens in 1861? The beginning of the Civil War. And we understand that if there had been a history of success, if they had not gone into a Laodicean condition in 1850, that Christ was to return in their own dispensation, in their own lifetime. Ellen White makes that explicitly clear.
Well, we also understand that October 22nd, 1844 was a shut door. Where is October 22, 1844 in this reform line? Up here. It's not there. So we have to recognize that there's a reform line underneath. There's a fractal, a shadow. Without building the history in between, this is October 22nd, 1844. And we know here that there was a shut door. And if there's a shut door, then this is close of probation. It's the beginning of the time of trouble. So we can see already that this top reform line is like the line of the 144,000, but there's still going to be these progressive steps. You have the time of trouble that was a civil war, but you also have this first group, the Millerites. They experienced their great test, their shut door, their close of probation, the beginning of their time of trouble on October 22nd, 1844.
This begins a time period of harvest. So we have harvest, 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 harvest. There's 4 harvests. October 22nd begins a harvest. In that time of trouble, they are scattered. We're going to read from a couple of quotes, and there's quite a lot in these quotes, but we're just looking for one thought. If we can follow that one thought, we might go back into those quotes at a later time to glean some of the other interesting thoughts. But we're just looking for one thing. So we're going to go to Life Sketches, page 97, paragraph 5.
We're going to quote, but this won't be found in Ellen White's writing. It's in the pioneer writings of N.P. Gleaner, March 30th, 1910. We'll just look at those two. The first one is Ellen White. It's actually this quote itself, and it's in quotation marks. This is actually Bates. This is Joseph Bates when he's trying to ascertain the authenticity of Ellen White and her visions. And the quote says, I therefore sought opportunities in the presence of others when her mind seemed freed from excitement out of a meeting to question and cross-question her and her friends which accompanied her, especially her elder sister, to get, if possible, at the truth. He gives a little more information and says, I believe the work is of God and is given to comfort and strengthen his scattered, torn, and peeled people since the closing up of our work for the world in October 1844. That's the part we want to look at for this. This was published by James White in 1847. It's that part what Joseph Bates is recognizing, however, much they don't understand the prophetic framework of what has taken place. He recognizes that there was a work that closed up from October 1844, and God's people are now what? They're now scattered, torn, and peeled. We'll focus on the word scattered. So they're disappointed in October 22nd, 1844, and God's people right here are scattered.
Or other quote, this is not Ellen White. After the disappointment, light is given on the sanctuary question, the Sabbath truth, and the three messages of Revelation 14. The cities of the East were given the light of present truth. So there was light in that dispensation, which is important, and we're going to come back to that. But again, that isn't the theme of the thread that we're pulling now. Light shone on the pathway of the scattered believers concerning the near advent of their Lord, and some received the message gladly. We've just looked at two quotes. One's Joseph Bates, and it's written in Life Sketches. One is someone separate, and then we'll see Ellen White, and they all describe this time period as a time period of scattering, when they were not bringing a message to the world with any effect.
So when we look over in Omega history, we see that there are two calls for the church. 2019 waymark for us, the cross for the disciples, and this is October 22nd. It's a close of probation for the first group called. And this is October 22nd, close of probation for the first group called. So this 1850 being a Sunday law, at the Sunday law, who do you go to? Church or world? Sunday law 34 AD, you go to the world. And here you go to the Gentiles. Right here.
So, prior to going to the world, what would you expect to see? Before the gospel goes to the world, it goes to the church in how many steps? 2 steps. So you have one step here, October 22nd, the experience of the Millerites at that harvest time, that scattering time after October 22nd. Then we have to ascertain this date. When would there be a second call back to the church between October 22nd, 1844 and 1850? Because we've seen 2 calls to the church before the message goes to the world. We want to go to a well-familiar quote, but we're going to read it from another perspective following this thread.
The next quote, Review and Herald, November 1, 1850, paragraph 9, a well-familiar quote for us. This was written dated November 1st, 1850, and we are here on our line. She says September 23rd, so it's written November 1st, and she's going back to September. And it says, September 23rd, the Lord showed me that he had stretched out his hand the second time to recover the remnant of his people. And what time was the second time? When was the first time? When was his hand stretched to gather his people the first time? It was the 1798 through the 1844 time. Then his people were scattered. And now he's going to stretch out his hand and gather a second time. So this reform line is the first gathering. He stretched out his hand, and a hand has how many fingers? 5 way marks and 4 dispensations.
So there's a first gathering, and then what begins with 1850. The second gathering. Is that the case for the Alpha history? God stretched out his hand to gather a remnant of his people, the disciples. Then he stretched out his hand again and gave the Jews at Pentecost. At 34 AD, that is a third attempt. Then he reaches out his hand a third time, and now it has come out of Babylon, my people. Out of the statue, not out of the mountain.
You're going in and out. We can't hear you. I can read along.
Come out of the world, not out of the church. So 2 calls to the church, and then there's a third call for God's people to come out of Babylon, to come out of the statue, to come out of the world. That's the third call. But in 1850, is it the third? No, it's the second call. September 23rd, the Lord showed me that he had stretched out his hand the second time to recover the remnant of his people, and that efforts must be redoubled in the gathering time. In the scattering, Israel was smitten and torn, but now in the gathering, God will heal and bind up his people. When did the scattering begin? October 22nd, 1844. When did it end? 1850.
Can you gather someone while you yourself are scattered? No. When God's people are scattered, they cannot do a work of gathering. That's why in the scattering efforts to spread the truth had but little effect, accomplished but little or nothing. But in the gathering, when God has set his hand to gather his people, efforts to spread the truth will have their designed effect, and all should be united and zealous in the work.
So this model is wrong. If God's people are scattered, they're scattered from October 22nd, 1844, all the way to 1850. This is where you take an alpha history and you compare and contrast. You compare an alpha history with an omega history, but you also contrast. What we're identifying is a contrast. There are 2 gatherings for the church in an omega history. For an alpha history, where's the church? Where is Israel? It's under construction. This is the beginning of modern Israel, so there is no point of gathering twice. You're going to gather a people, form modern Israel, and then have that new institution do a work for the world. At the end of modern Israel, you have this Laodicean church to deal with, and that's why it needs these 2 efforts, 2 calls into that Laodicean church. You don't have the dynamic in an alpha history.
So God's people were scattered all the way from October 22nd, 1844 to 1850. So does the line of Alpha Ancient Israel have the same dynamic? The last couple of weeks, we've gone over this point about priests, Levites, and Nethinims. We've shown how it existed as God's people are called out of the idolatry of Rome. You have two calls to the church. We showed how it developed from Ezra 7:9 in the 2014, based on the history of Babylon. How many calls do you have to come out of Babylon for the Jews? 2, priests, and then the Levites. The priests are called out, and then Ezra looks at them and says, where are the Levites? There's no one of the tribe of Levi. So he has to send back into Babylon, and there has to be a second Exodus.
When it comes to Egypt, how many exoduses of Israel occurred from Egypt? Just one. So 2 calls for ancient Israel to remove themselves from the idolatry of Rome. 2 calls for ancient Israel to leave Babylon. How many groups left Egypt? Only one. There's only one Exodus. You didn't have one group leave Egypt, cross the Red Sea, then say there isn't enough. We left people behind. They didn't go back into Egypt and call out a second group. So you have only one call to Israel. These reform lines have not been properly developed. It's been discussed before how God is opening up reform lines in a more thorough fashion, step by step. We haven't yet properly dealt with the history of the Exodus, the beginning of ancient Israel. But you can already see that if it's the same pattern, there's only one call at the beginning of the history of Adventism that forms Adventism, and then in 1850, they're going to make another call into the world.
So you have the harvest for the Millerites in that gathering time from 1850 to 1861. Then you have the time of trouble. That harvest of 1861 to 1863 of those who should have numbered the 144,000. We know that where our history ends at Paneum prior to the Sunday Law, their second Advent waymark extended all the way to 1850. So the 1798, 1840, the shut door, and the scattering of October 22nd, 1844, and that scattering extended to 1850. We know that important things happened in that time. So we need to look at that. The middle waymark is July 22nd, 1844. What happens there? This is the Boston camp meeting. So we have Boston, Concord, Exeter, and Test. That's where we get those symbols from. So you have here the beginning of the midnight cry message that's going to grow and swell. It's midway, it's midnight, and the symbols associated with the Sunday Law. So this is the first group called, this is the Millerites.
Then we can construct a second line underneath, and it takes you to 1861. Where is the call going to this group? What is that latter rain, loud cry message going? When it's the world, it's the Nephilims. It's the history of the 144,000. The latter rain that coincides with their harvest, because it's a latter rain for the 144,000. But it's the harvest for the world. The harvest for the world is when they are cut out of that statue, when they are cut from the world and join God's people. Come out of Babylon is the call of the loud cry. They come out in the Sunday Law history, in the time period of their harvest. If you want that explained more clearly, It was discussed quite thoroughly in Holland.
So there's this second gathering that began in 1850. The first gathering, the Millerites, what was their tool? What was their weapon? The 1843 chart. So they have the 1843 chart as their weapon in this time period. What about the history of the world, 1850? They have the 1850 chart. That was the weapon that they have to take the gospel, the message in the second period of gathering. So we have harvest in the first group. God reached out his hand and a second time to gather to harvest the world. Then you have that time of trouble, the close of probation, and the Civil War. We wanted to put that structure in place so we can see when we go back into Millerite history that we can know what our framework is. We can know what structures we're to look at. So when someone asks what would make 1861 a second coming for the world, so someone asked, that would make 1861 a second coming for the world, wouldn't it? So whose close of probation is 1861? It's the exact same answer you'd have for the 144,000. Whose close of probation is Daniel 12:1? So close of probation on which line? It's 144,000. So it's a close of probation for the 144,000. If you can try and explain our fractals in the following way, we say fractals, but that's not entirely accurate. It's not a perfect fractal. What we're seeing is we can visualize it as a shadow. The line of 144,000 is your body. It has all the details of the body. It has the shape of the nose. It has the shading of your skin. It has your freckles, if you have them, the dimples in your cheeks, the shade of the eyes. It has all those details. This template line is like the body. And then as we see God prepare these three groups, again, it's an imperfect parable, but it has the semblance of a shadow.
It doesn't have all of the form and it doesn't have all of the details of the body. So when we come to the Sunday law on the 144,000 line, you would expect to see a law in Congress that forces you to either disobey that law or violate the law of God. Did that occur in 2014? No. But 2014 is a Sunday law. It is the Sunday law for the first group called, but it is also marking progression. It's showing us the steps, the successive steps that bring you to that law. We look at 2014 and saw the changes in the legislative and the judicial branches. Doesn't have all of the appearance of the body, but it does show that shape. "2019 is a shut door. Did Christ cease intercession? No, but you know that there was a shut door there, that there was a test that faced this movement that divided us, and it continues to divide us into two groups of people. We stand here at Concord, the death decree. Is there a death decree facing us now, right now? No, but we can see the time of trouble. What happens at the death decree? All those opposed to the movement of God has raised up, coming to unity on one thing and one thing alone, and it's their opposition to that movement. What do we find at Concord? Everyone who stands in opposition to the midnight cry comes into unity. They are in unity on nothing except their opposition to this movement, and that is why we face a further shaking now. Everyone who rejects the midnight cry comes into unity on that one point. So we experience the death decree in the form of a shadow.
That's kind of an interesting point with listening to this morning, listening to the class about what we find at Concord, externally and internally. She's talking here internally, but externally too. They come into unity with, they're in opposition to the rights of humanity, the rights of women, but they're coming into unity. I might have said that wrong, but I think you guys understood.
Right. Thank you. The second advent, is there a literal second advent here? No, but you can see it. You can see the shut door. You can see the Sunday law, the midnight cry, the latter rain, time of trouble, conquered at death decree, externally and internally. Conquered, the upper room, the second advent. You have all the shadow there, but it's powerful, but it doesn't have all the contours of the body that you expect to find in the template line. So when we look at the close of probations, that is what we see, successive shut doors. We know it's a shut door of the 144,000, but therefore the 144,000 in the world in its entirety is an end of intercession.
In closing, we'll summarize. We've reminded ourselves of the four reform lines that constructed the end of ancient and the end of modern Israel. We've reminded ourselves that there are three groups called the 144,000 coming from one of those groups. But there are three groups: priests, Levites, and Nethinims. Church, world. We've seen that the two groups, the disciples, the Jews at Pentecost, and the Gentiles at 34 AD.
The Jews failed because they were so focused on the restoration of the glorious land. They're so focused on what they believe is about to occur externally that they failed to experience the necessary steps internally that would take them to 34 AD. Because they fail in the history leading to 34 AD, there's no hope for them beyond as an institution and for many of them individually. Adventism is going down the same road. The whole world is split into these two camps, and Adventism finds himself standing on the side that is already directly opposed to what prophecy tells us.
Can I ask a question real quick? Are those two, what did you just say? Sorry, two, what did you say? Oh, two sides. So
Camps,
that is the culture war, right? The culture war. I'm just asking, like, just for now where we are in our understanding, two sides of the culture war. I don't know. That's I was just thinking as to our understanding now.
And this is internally. But Adventism is on two sides, but this is internally.
Right. Oh, right. So externally, that would be the
They're following the external.
Huh?
They're following the external.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, as Elder Tess has been teaching us, that majority of the men in the movement are in the camp of the Marxists.
Yeah. Culture.
Yes, the culture. And they don't even know it.
Thank you.
So we'll make one final point about that. Two camps. You have social liberalism says the great threat is nationalism. You have social conservatism says the great threat is globalism. Satanic deep state, the United Nations coming into unity, working as a bloc, the European nation, the World Health Organization, you have these two different sides. When we have the current shaking in this movement, what people are doing is saying, if I have the freedom, if you truly give me freedom, then I am liberal, but I have the freedom to be socially conservative.
So if someone says I'm a woman, I'm in Kakuma refugee camp, I'm South Sudanese, and I believe in liberalism. Therefore, I have freedom. Therefore, I have the freedom to be bought and sold like a slave, to have someone pay dowry for me. The way people are using the concept freedom is to actually attack and undermine the exact freedom they're offered. They're seeing equality, freedom. Therefore, we have the freedom to be socially conservative, to pay dowry, to not practice equality, to focus on the type of deeply entrenched conservative Hollywood ideals that place the value of a woman on her body and her appearance.
This freedom that is occurring under the current issues that have split this movement is a so-called freedom to stand on the wrong side. All that we're saying is that we're failing the test. You think you're a liberal, but you're a conservative. If you think freedom means that you don't have to study for the test, then you're already failing it. That freedom is designed to help us to prepare for the test, not to say I have the freedom to fail it. I have the freedom to not study for it, and somehow because of that freedom, I'll be saved. What we're seeing now being done in the name of freedom is nothing more than social conservatism and inequality rebranded.
We saw two calls for the church and one call for the world. We went back and we saw this middle history. We came out of Babylon. Two groups of the Jews came out of Babylon, the priests and the Levites.
In 1888, we haven't touched. Coming back to our Alpha history, the Alpha of ancient is the calling out of Egypt. The Alpha of modern is the calling out of apostate Protestantism.
We've made a contrast between Alpha and Omega histories. In an Alpha history, there's only one call for the church. We saw that also in Egypt. They only leave Egypt as one body, as one group. Then they're going to go through their own scattering, their own wilderness experience. Then they go into Canaan and do a work for the church, for the world. So you have one group scattered, then they go and they do a work in Canaan. In the Alpha of the modern one group scattered from October 22nd, 1844, all the way to 1850, which is the Sunday law. When we're scattered, there is no bringing of the message. There's no message to offer.
Then at 1850, they're going to go forward and do a work for the world. So we stand here and we have to understand, particularly this dispensation internally, but we have to understand all this history externally. Every single one of these waymarks are external events. Every single one of these waymarks are external events. And we suggest this is all about external events. You know that 1861 is, 1850 is, 1798 is, and 1840 is. Then the only thing we need to know, the first thing we need to nail down is 1844 and that presidential election.
Also to remind us, if 1844 is a presidential election, what else is a presidential election? Go back one presidential term in 1840 is a presidential election. It's interesting, 1840 elects the 9th US president. He dies while in office. His vice president becomes president, finishes that term. So in 1844, what number US president is elected? And that's the 11th.
So we're marking 1840, which lines up with 9/11. You have 9/11, the 9th US president elected dies in office. October 22nd lines up with 2019. You have the 11th US president elected. 11th because you had a death in the office of the 9th. The 10th being his vice. The 11th being the 1844 elected James Polk. So even there, you have 9 and 11. All about the external events. 1798, 1840, the 9th president, 1850, 1861, 1863, 1798, 1844, the 11th president. 1840 through 1863, you have 6 elections. You have 9 US presidents, 2 deaths in office, intense political time period.
This is a history of intense external events. And from 1840 to 1863, how many presidential elections? And Phil already said that there's 6. You have 6 presidential elections between 1840 to 1863. How many US presidents do you have in those 6 elections? So if you have 6 presidential elections, you would either expect that you would either have 3 because they'd be 2 terms and 2 terms, which is 6, or you would have a maximum of 6. But actually you have Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison, James John Tyler, James K. Polk, Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, James Buchanan, and then Abraham Lincoln.
You have 9 United States presidents in a history when you only have 6 US elections. You have 2 deaths in office, and one of them, the reason you get the 9th is because of that 1840 election where you have 2 close together. So this is an intense political time. The 1840 election was the turning point. The 1844 election was the turning point in US history. And we want to understand the external events that brought us not just to the Civil War, but to that 1850 compromise. When you find the sin being laid not just on the South, but on the North as well.
Before we do any of that, we need to have correctly the structure put in place. We've compared and contrasted the Alpha and Omega histories. We'll review this next time so we can have those constructs clearly in our mind, and clearly in our mind why there's this contrast. And it's neat that we can already see that it fits with the history of Egypt. It fits with the history of ancient Israel, 1 call to the church. In Babylon, 2 calls to the church. In Rome, 2 calls to the church.
Can you back up to that previous slide?
Mm-hmm.
One right before it? Okay, right, yeah. When you find the sin being laid not just at the South, but on the North as well, isn't that kind of what, I mean, we knew this to some extent, but isn't that kind of what she's laying out? If I'm understanding and following correctly? Because we've been looking at the right and all that they're doing, but now we're seeing the left is no better.
Mhm.
Is that right?
That's what it's looking like.
So make sure I'm following that correctly. Because
Looking that way.
because the Civil War, everything led up to the Civil War, and the Civil War was meant to be the time of trouble. The Civil War was that time of trouble. So what we're seeing now is heading us to a place that will be the time of trouble.
Can I say one thing about that, what you just said, Elaine? Because that made me think Elder Tess is discussing the far right and the far left. And we're looking, we're to understand that they're not, how can I say it? They're not the same. They both have their problems, but they're not, we can't just say, what is it that we just heard this morning?
She was talking about libertarianism. You can't, it's not that easy. I don't know if that's the right word she said it, but I think that's what you're talking about. It's not as simple as just saying they, I don't remember how she worded it. Maybe somebody else does. How it's libertarianism. But she goes to show deeper into the far left. Maybe somebody remembers it a little bit better than what I do to explain it. I think that's what you're talking about, right, Victoria?
I'm kind of talking about where she's talking about where we looked into the far right, and now we're looking at the far left. Maybe I have it. I'm not understanding, but how some people will see the problems in the right and then the problems in the left, and like, well, then, they're all bad, but we're understanding that we're still left wing, but they have their problems too, but I don't know how I want to put it. I have to still digest what she's saying. Sorry, I didn't want to. Sorry.
Troy put in here that it's not just simple to say they are the same.
Thank you. Yes, that's what she said, but sorry, I still have to digest, and I kind of messed up on my point, I guess, of what I wanted to understand.
Well, I
Sorry.
might have messed you up too, adding in the libertarian comment, because she made that as well, about not being as simple as just say that, because I was thinking in my mind, because the libertarians came from the liberals. So I was connecting that, and I don't know if there was that connection there, but that's how then she goes on to she's better defining the far left, this liberal side that has, you compare and contrast them, I guess, and you can see the similarities in them, but it's not as simple just say they're the same. There's concord. Troy says there is concord, but they come from different points and background.
Yes, thank you, Troy. Yes.
Anybody else?
No, but this kind of brings home the fact that this is not our home. This is not the government of God.
Correct.
And so setting up that government and being faithful to what God has called us to do, so that those who are looking are going to see the true government of God.
The ambassadors.
Ambassadors, yes.
The ambassadors, they will have to recognize, especially it's, I mean, as we talked about it earlier, if I was following her correctly, that what we're seeing is the external events are, I think this is where she's headed with some of the articles, but or the way I understood it, that the the external events we know is what ripens the harvest. So you're either ripe for the wrong side or you're ripe for the right side, and ripe for the right side would have to mean radical feminists, people that are standing up for human rights, radical. And lost my train of thought, something to do with what you're, so they have to know where to go when they do come to that place. And that's where we have to be true ambassadors. There's no, isn't the word concord used in the Bible with this? There's no concord between, does it say Christ and Belial? Is that how it says it?
What was
Belial?
that again?
No, doesn't the Bible say that there's no, I think the word is used, no concord between Christ and Belial? I don't know if I'm saying that word right.
The verse goes like this. It's 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 15. And what concord hath Christ with Belial? Or what path hath he that believeth with an infidel?
Yeah. So we will show no concord with the world in all that they are, and all of their hatred. And this is why I think it's so important for us. Thank you, Christine. So important for us to understand who we are called to be. And plus what we were talking about earlier is like how, lost my train of thought again, but being representatives of that kingdom and having a firm stand when it comes to doing the right, knowing the right, and when there's misjustice, that's not the right way to say that, is there? Injustices, to stand up against them. And what she seems to be showing is how these two sides are going to come together. So we have to be that uncompromising, there is no concord. So we have to be uncompromising as ambassadors for the kingdom of God.
Yeah.
If you'd like, we have a lot of time, but if you'd like, close it in prayer and we'll end this recording, and then we can discuss afterwards and see where to go. Do you want to do that?
Yes.
It sounds good to me.
Yep. That's good.
Christine, would you
Yes.
like to pray? Or unless somebody's going to pray, go ahead.
Go ahead, Christine.
Dear Heavenly God, we thank you so much for the Sabbath day and all that you have taught us. We thank you for helping us to get these ideas established in our mind, to help us to see that the far, far left is not where we want to be either, that your kingdom is not of this world, and that we have to stand firm in what you're teaching us, and that we need to be ready to go against the law of the land, to obey your laws. Please, Lord, we pray that you will give us the strength and courage and wisdom and humility to follow in this truth that you're teaching us, to stand firm, to be an example, to show the light to the world that you're giving us. We're ever so grateful and honored and humbled to be chosen. And we pray that you'll help us to be faithful unto the very end. And we pray all this in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.